A cattle rustler's worst nightmare isn't the law. It's crossing paths with someone who has nothing left to lose but the one thing they're determined to keep. In the rugged expanse of Wyoming's Powder River Basin, Sarah Hargrove was about to teach the notorious Blackwell Gang a lesson they'd never forget, if they lived long enough to remember it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat shimmered across the vast grasslands as Sarah stood on the worn porch of the Split Pine Ranch, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. At 42, the lines around her eyes told stories of both laughter and hardship, but it was the steady gaze beneath her broad-brimmed hat that revealed her true nature. From a distance, she might have looked like any rancher's widow, resilient, hard-working, perhaps a little worn down by the harsh realities of frontier life. Nothing about her slight frame or quiet demeanor suggested anything extraordinary. Nothing, that is, except the gleaming Winchester rifle that never strayed far from her reach. "Riders coming," called Eli Thompson, her foreman of 3 years, as he approached from the main corral. "Dust cloud from the North Ridge." Sarah nodded, setting her coffee aside as she reached for her rifle with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. Moving slow, not trying to hide. Their approach, a faint smile crossed Sarah's face. "Those would be the ones I'm not worried about." She checked the rifle's action with practiced hands, the metal gleaming in the morning sun. "It's the ones we don't see that concern me." Eli shifted uncomfortably. At 28, he was capable and loyal, but the news from town had left him on edge. "Are you sure about this drive, Mrs. Hargrove? After what happened to the Miller outfit last week?" "I'm sure about one thing, Eli. Those cattle need to get to Cheyenne." Sarah's voice carried quiet authority. 200 heads represent everything I have left, everything Thomas worked for." She didn't need to elaborate. Everyone in 3 counties knew how Thomas Hargrove had died defending his land during last winter's blizzard, not from the cold, but from a bullet. The official story claimed it was a hunting accident. Those who knew better kept their suspicions to themselves, especially after the territory's largest cattle baron, James Blackwell, expressed his deepest condolences, while simultaneously making offers to buy the struggling Split Pine for a fraction of its worth. "The Blackwell Gang has hit 3 small drives heading to Cheyenne this season," Eli continued. "They're getting bolder. Sheriff Parker does nothing." "Sheriff Parker knows which side his bread is buttered on," Sarah replied, her green eyes hardening. "And James Blackwell has a long knife and plenty of butter." The approaching riders crested the hill, silhouettes sharpening against the brilliant blue sky. Sarah recognized the lead rider immediately, Michael Hayes, owner of the neighboring Broken Wheel Ranch and one of the few allies she had left. "They'll come for you on the high stretch through Thunder Canyon," Hayes announced without preamble as he dismounted. His weathered face was grim beneath his gray-streaked beard. "Wilson's outfit got hit there yesterday, lost 60 heads and—" "2 good men," Sarah nodded, offering Hayes water from the nearby bucket. "How many in Blackwell's crew now?" 15, maybe more. Hired guns, mostly. "Mean as snakes and twice as venomous." Hayes drank deeply before continuing. "Word is they're aiming to control the whole territory's beef market by fall. Small ranchers either sell to Blackwell or find their herds mysteriously depleted. And the law?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Hayes spat in the dust. "Sheriff claims he doesn't have the men to patrol the canyon. Meanwhile, he's sporting a new silver pocket watch that looks mighty similar to the one James Blackwell wears." The small group fell silent, the implications hanging heavy in the air. Sarah looked past them, to the sprawling pasture where her cattle grazed, unaware of the human machinations that would determine their fate. "We leave at first light," she said finally. 20 men, all armed. We'll take the eastern route through. Cottonwood Draw. Hayes raised an eyebrow. That adds 2 days to the journey. Rough country. Yes, Sarah agreed, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Very rough for anyone who doesn't know it like I do. What Sarah didn't say, what few people remembered, was that before she was Sarah Hargrove, Rancher's wife, she had been Sarah Mitchell, the most celebrated sharpshooter in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. For 7 years she had amazed crowds across America and Europe with marksmanship that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She could split playing cards on edge, snuff candle flames, and hit moving targets while riding at full gallop, all with a calm precision that earned her the nickname Steady Eye Sarah. That was before she'd met Thomas Hargrove at a Chicago exhibition, before she'd traded fame for love and a different kind of life, before she'd packed away her performing clothes and custom-made rifles, keeping only the skills that had made her legendary. They say Blackwell's bringing in some former cavalry scouts, Hayes continued. Man named Curtis, supposedly has a reputation as a tracker and a killer. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes at the name, recognition perhaps, or concern, but it was gone so quickly that Hayes couldn't be certain he'd seen it at all. Get word to Abe Jackson at the Lazy J, she instructed Eli. Tell him we'll need those extra horses we discussed, and send Jimmy to alert Maria Rodriguez that we'll need her boys as outriders. As Eli nodded and moved to follow her instructions, Sarah turned back to Hayes. Michael, I'd consider it a favor if you'd spread word that we're delaying our drive for a week due to concerns about the water levels in the basin. Hayes studied her for a long moment. You're baiting them. Sarah's expression remained unchanged. I'm taking my cattle to market by the route and timeline of my choosing. If certain parties make incorrect assumptions about those choices, that's hardly my concern. A young ranch hand approached cautiously, hat in hand. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Hargrove, but there's a lady from town asking for you. Says her name is Rebecca Curtis. This time, the flash of recognition in Sarah's eyes was unmistakable. She nodded once, straightening her shoulders slightly before turning to Hayes. You'll excuse me, Michael. It seems I have an unexpected visitor. As Sarah walked toward the main house, Hayes turned to Eli with a puzzled expression. Curtis? Any relation to the man Blackwell's bringing in? Eli shrugged. Don't know. But I'll tell you this. Mrs. Hargrove doesn't rattle easy, and something about that name sure seemed to get her attention. Inside the cool shadows of the ranch house, Sarah found a slender woman in a dusty traveling dress, waiting nervously. In the front room, though approaching 40, Rebecca Curtis retained the refined bearing of her Eastern upbringing, her honey-blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. It's been a long time, Becky, Sarah said quietly, closing the door behind her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca turned, her blue eyes widening slightly as she took in the woman before her. Sarah Mitchell, they said you'd married a rancher, but I hardly believed it. It's Hargrove now, Sarah corrected. Has been 12 years. I'm sorry about your husband, Rebecca said with genuine sympathy in her voice. I heard what happened. Sarah inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, but didn't respond directly. Instead, she asked, What brings you to Split Pine, Becky? Last I heard you were teaching school back in St. Louis. I was, Rebecca confirmed, twisting her gloved hands together. Until Jack wrote asking me to come west, said he had a promising position with a cattle operation. I arrived in Cheyenne last week to discover my brother working as an enforcer for a man named Blackwell. Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral. Jack Curtis was always good at finding trouble. And you were always good at getting him out of it, Rebecca countered, a hint of desperation entering her voice. Sarah, he respects you. He'll listen to you. This Blackwell, he's using Jack's skills, his reputation to hurt people. My brother may be many things, but he's not a cold-blooded killer. A long silence stretched between them, weighted with shared history and unspoken questions. "What exactly are you asking of me, Becky?" Sarah finally asked. "Talk to him, before this goes too far, before he does something he can't come back from." Rebecca stepped forward earnestly. "They're planning something big, Sarah. I've overheard. Things. They mean to make an example of someone who's been defying Blackwell." Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the distant cattle, her mind working rapidly. "When did you last see your brother?" "Yesterday. He's camped with Blackwell's men at the old Wilson mining claim. They've been watching the trails, the ranches." Rebecca hesitated before adding, "He asked about you when he heard where I was headed, seemed surprised to learn you were still in these parts." Sarah turned back to face her old acquaintance. "And did you tell him about my cattle drive?" I mentioned. "You were preparing for one, yes." Rebecca's eyes widened suddenly as she realized the implication. "Sarah, if they come after your herd, then Jack Curtis and I will have a long overdue reunion," Sarah finished, her voice carrying a steely calm that made Rebecca take an involuntary step backward. "Thank you for the warning, Becky. You're welcome to stay the night. The trails aren't safe after dark." "You don't seem concerned," Rebecca observed, studying Sarah with growing confusion. Sarah's lips curved in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I gave up concern for Lent 12 years ago, and never picked it back up again." She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. "One more thing, Becky. Does your brother still favor that Remington revolver with the custom grip?" Rebecca blinked in surprise. "Yes, says it's perfectly weighted for his hand. How did you remember that after all these years?" "I remember everything about a person's shooting habits," Sarah replied. "It's a peculiarity of mine." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Sarah strode purposefully toward the barn. The ranch hands watched her with curious expressions, sensing the subtle shift in her demeanor. Gone was the quiet rancher's widow. In her place moved someone else entirely, someone with the focused intensity of a predator. In the shadowed interior of the barn, Sarah unlocked a worn trunk tucked beneath the hayloft ladder. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay items she hadn't touched in years. A told leather gun belt with custom holsters, a pair of matched Colt revolvers with pearl handles, and most significantly, a specially modified Winchester rifle with a telescopic sight, a rarity in the territories. As her fingers traced the familiar contours of the weapons, memories flooded back. The roar of the crowd as she fired from horseback, the smell of gunpowder, the absolute certainty that came with knowing exactly where her bullet would land before she even pulled the trigger. And intertwined with those memories, others less public, teaching a young cavalry scout named Jack Curtis to improve his draw, laughing as he tried to match her speed and accuracy, the friendship that had developed between them during her time with the Wild West show. Sarah removed the rifle, checking its action with practiced hands. Despite the years of disuse, she had maintained it meticulously, cleaning and oiling it regularly, even as it remained hidden away. Some habits, like some skills, never truly disappeared. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Eli's voice came from the barn entrance, hesitant to intrude on what seemed like a private moment. Sarah didn't look up from her inspection of the rifle. "Send riders to the Rodriguez place and the Lazy J tonight, not tomorrow. Tell them we're moving the timetable up. We leave at first light." "Yes, ma'am." Eli paused before asking, "Is there trouble coming?" Now Sarah did look up, and something in her expression made Eli straighten involuntarily. "Trouble's been here a while, Eli. It's just finally showing its face." She returned the rifle to its case before adding, "And tell the men to pack extra ammunition. I have a feeling we're going to need it." As Eli departed to carry out her instructions, Sarah remained in the barn, her thoughts turning to Jack Curtis. Once, He had been among the few people she genuinely trusted, a skilled marksman with a natural talent she had helped refine. Now, it seemed he had become something else entirely, a weapon pointed directly at her livelihood, perhaps even her life. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas had wanted her to leave that life behind, to become simply Sarah Hargrove, loving wife and capable rancher. He had seen her skills as entertaining tricks, not understanding they were the product of a discipline and focus few people possessed. He had loved her, but he had never fully comprehended the woman he married. Now, with Thomas gone and everything they'd built together threatened, Sarah found herself reaching back to the person she had been before, not with reluctance, but with a sense of rightness, like slipping on a well-worn glove. As dusk settled over Split Pine Ranch, Sarah emerged from the barn carrying her old performance rifle, her stride purposeful as she headed toward the south pasture. The ranch hands exchanged glances, but said nothing as she set up makeshift targets at increasingly challenging distances. They had never seen Mrs. Hargrove practice shooting before. She had always been a capable shot when necessary, but nothing extraordinary. What they witnessed over the next hour left them speechless. Starting with stationary targets, Sarah worked through a series of increasingly difficult shots, moving from standing to kneeling to prone positions, adjusting for wind and distance with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Then calling for her horse to be brought around, not her usual gentle mare, but the spirited black gelding she rarely rode, she demonstrated why Buffalo Bill had once called her the finest mounted sharpshooter in the world. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah put 6 consecutive bullets through a playing card tacked to a fence post at 200 yards, while riding past it at a gallop. "Sweet Jesus," whispered one of the younger hands, crossing himself. "Did you see that?" Eli Thompson stood apart from the others, his expression thoughtful as he watched Sarah dismount and check her rifle one final time before heading back to the main house. He had worked for the Hargroves for 3 years, respected Thomas, and had come to admire Sarah's quiet strength in the months since her husband's death. But this was something else entirely. "You knew, didn't you?" Hayes asked quietly, appearing beside Eli in the gathering darkness. "About who she really is." "Suspected," Eli admitted. "Found an old poster once when I was looking for tools in the back storeroom. Showed a woman who looked mighty familiar, standing with Buffalo Bill himself. Called her Steady Eye Sarah, the woman who never misses. Didn't seem like my place to ask about it." Hayes nodded slowly. Thomas wanted a wife, not a celebrity. Can't blame a man for wanting a normal life. But right about now, I'm thinking, the Blackwell gang is about to discover that Mrs. Sarah Hargrove is anything but normal. Inside the ranch house, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Rebecca Curtis, the tension between them palpable as they sipped coffee in silence. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you planning to do, Sarah?" Sarah's green eyes reflected the lamplight as she considered her response. "I'm going to drive my cattle to Cheyenne, as I've always intended, and if Jack tries to stop you, then I'll deal with Jack Curtis the same way I deal with anyone who threatens what's mine." Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of both anger and bravado. "Your brother made his choice when he signed on with Blackwell." Rebecca studied her with growing concern. "You've changed. The Sarah I knew wasn't cold like this. The Sarah you knew performed tricks for applause," Sarah replied, evenly. "This isn't a performance, Becky. This is survival." She stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "We leave at dawn. You're welcome to stay here until it's safe to return to town." As Rebecca watched her former friend walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just glimpsed something few people ever saw, the iron core beneath Sarah Hargrove's composed exterior. In that moment, despite her concern for her brother, Rebecca found herself almost pitying the Blackwell gang. They had no idea what they were riding into. The night settled over Split Pine Ranch like a heavy blanket, stars speckling the vast Wyoming sky as Sarah stood on her porch, watching, waiting. Tomorrow would bring challenges she had spent 12 years avoiding, forcing her to become once again the woman she had set aside for love of a good man and the promise of a different life. In the distance, coyotes howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the emptiness she had carried since Thomas's death. But beneath that grief lay something else, something that had been awakening slowly over the past months. Determination, purpose, and a cold clarity about what needed to be done. The Blackwell gang thought they were targeting a vulnerable widow struggling to hold on to her ranch. They couldn't know they were actually challenging one of the most naturally gifted sharpshooters the West had ever known, a woman who had once made impossible shots seem routine, who could calculate wind and distance as easily as others breathed, whose hands remained rock-steady even as chaos erupted around her. Tomorrow, Sarah Hargrove would remind Jack Curtis and anyone who rode with him exactly who she had been. More importantly, she would show them who she had become. A woman with nothing left to lose except the one thing she would defend to her last breath. The legacy she and Thomas had built together in this harsh, beautiful country. And God help anyone who stood in her way. Dawn broke over the Powder River Basin, painting the rugged landscape in hues of amber and gold. The Split Pine Ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of prime Wyoming territory, nestled between rolling grasslands to the east and the jagged silhouette of the Bighorn Mountains to the west. A natural spring fed the crystal-clear creek that bisected the property, making it one of the most valuable ranches in the region and one of the most coveted by men like James Blackwell. Sarah Hargrove stood at the corral fence, watching as her ranch hands prepared for the day ahead. Already, the organized chaos of a cattle drive was taking shape. Chuck wagons being loaded, horses saddled, supplies inventoried. The air carried the mingled scents of coffee, leather, dust, and livestock, smells that had become as familiar to Sarah as the perfumes and powders of her show days once were. 218 heads, all counted and ready, reported Eli, joining her at the fence. Dawn's early light accentuated the worry lines creasing his forehead. Best stock in 3 counties, prime beef that'll fetch top dollar in Cheyenne. Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting to the distant herd. The cattle represented more than just livelihood. They were the culmination of Thomas's careful breeding program, generations of selective stock improvement that had produced animals uniquely adapted to the harsh Wyoming environment. Some ranchers focused on quantity. Thomas Hargrove had built his reputation on quality. Roundup went smoother than expected, Eli continued. Even that ornery longhorn bull cooperated. Thunder always did have a soft spot for Jackson's handling, Sarah replied, referring to the Rodriguez family's eldest son, whose gentle way with difficult animals had proved invaluable during past drives. The Split Pine brand, a simple pine, tree bisected by a diagonal line, was visible on the nearest cattle, the mark distinctive and clear against their hides. Thomas had designed it himself, saying it represented how their lives had been split between before and after they found this land. For Sarah, it had carried a double meaning. The division between her public persona as Steady-Eye Sarah and her, a private life as Mrs. Hargrove. Now that line was blurring in ways she had never anticipated. Mrs. Curtis is still asleep, Eli mentioned, glancing back toward the main house. Seemed pretty worn out from her journey. Let her rest, Sarah instructed. She won't be coming with us. She turned to face her foreman directly. Eli, there's something you should know before we head out. Something about me that might explain a few things. Eli shifted uncomfortably. If you're referring to your previous occupation, Mrs. Hargrove, I may have already pieced that together. A flicker of surprise crossed Sarah's face. Found an old show poster once, he explained. In the storage room. Figured it wasn't my business to bring it up. Sarah's lips curved in a slight smile. Thomas always said you were observant. Didn't take much observation to connect what I saw last night with that poster, Eli replied. Though I admit seeing it firsthand was something else. What you saw was rudimentary practice, Sarah said, her voice matter-of-fact. When I was with Buffalo Bill's show, I could hit a dime tossed in the air from 50 paces or split a playing card on edge while riding at full gallop. And now? Sarah's eyes took on a distant quality. I haven't performed professionally in 12 years, but some skills, once mastered, become part of you, like breathing. Before Eli could respond, a commotion at the far end of the corral drew their attention. Several hands were struggling with a magnificent black stallion whose powerful frame and gleaming coat marked him as something special. The horse reared, hooves slashing the air as two men attempted to secure his bridle. "Midnight," Sarah murmured, a note of affection in her voice. Still testing boundaries, Midnight had been Thomas's pride, a crossbreed of Kentucky thoroughbred and wild Mustang stock that combined speed, endurance, and intelligence in equal measure. Few people could handle him, fewer still could ride him effectively. Thomas had been one. Sarah, with her exceptional horsemanship developed during her show years, was another. "You're taking him on the drive?" Eli asked, surprise evident in his tone. "For certain stretches," Sarah confirmed. "No horse in Wyoming has better instincts in rough country." She moved toward the stallion, her approach confident but careful. The ranch hands stepped back automatically, watching as Sarah stood before the agitated horse, speaking in low tones that didn't carry to the observers. Gradually, Midnight's ears flicked forward, his posture relaxing as Sarah placed a gentle hand on his muzzle. "Never seen anything like it," murmured Pete Anderson, one of the older hands. "That devil wouldn't let anyone near him after Mr. Hargrove passed. Nearly killed Bradley when he tried to break him again." "Some creatures recognize kindred spirits," Eli observed quietly. Sarah led Midnight to a separate enclosure, checking his tack herself. The saddle, custom-made by a craftsman in Denver, featured subtle modifications that would allow for maximum stability during high-speed maneuvers. The stallion's exceptional balance and responsiveness had made him the perfect mount for precision shooting, though Sarah hadn't employed those particular skills during her years at Split Pine until now. A flurry of activity near the main gate announced the arrival of additional riders. Maria Rodriguez led a group of 5 men, all carrying rifles and wearing the distinctive red neckerchiefs of the Lazy J Ranch. Behind them came Abraham Jackson, the Lazy J's owner and one of Thomas Hargrove's oldest friends in the territory. "Sarah," Jackson called, dismounting with the fluid grace that belied his 60 years. "Got your message. Brought my best men and 16 extra horses." "Appreciated, Abe," Sarah replied, extending her hand. Jackson clasped it firmly, his dark eyes assessing her with fatherly concern. "You sure about this route?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Cottonwood Draw isn't friendly territory this time of year. Rattlers, rough water, narrow passes." "Which is precisely why Blackwell won't expect us to take it," Sarah pointed out. "His men are watching the main trails, particularly through Thunder Canyon. They'll be waiting for an easy ambush that won't come." Jackson nodded slowly. "Thomas always said you had a strategic mind. Guess this explains why." Sarah followed his gaze to where her specialized Winchester leaned against the corral fence. "Thomas preferred not to dwell on certain aspects of my background. Man liked his world orderly," Jackson agreed. "Compartmentalized. Sometimes I wondered if he truly understood what he had in you." A shadow crossed Sarah's face. "He understood enough." Maria Rodriguez approached, interrupting there. Conversation. At 45, Maria was a formidable presence, a widowed rancher who had maintained her husband's small operation through sheer determination and skill. Like Sarah, she had faced skepticism and outright hostility as a woman running a ranch. In man's territory, unlike Sarah, she had never bothered to hide her capabilities. "My sons are positioned along the eastern ridge," Maria reported, her slight accent punctuating her precise English. "They report no unusual activity, but the dust patterns suggest riders passed through recently. Someone is watching." Sarah accepted this information with a nod. "And your youngest boys? Diego and Carlos are ready with the remuda, 20 horses, all good mountain stock. The importance of fresh mounts couldn't be overstated." A cattle drive through standard terrain was grueling enough. The route Sarah had chosen would demand extraordinary endurance from both humans and animals. "We'll need them in the narrow sections," Sarah confirmed, "especially if we're forced to move faster than planned." As the final preparations continued, Sarah walked the perimeter of the ranch compound, her gaze constantly scanning the surrounding landscape. To the casual observer, she might have appeared to be simply checking the readiness of her operation. In reality, she was calculating distances, noting cover positions, identifying potential choke points, applying the same tactical assessment she had once used when planning her most challenging shooting exhibitions. The ranch itself sat in a natural depression, providing both shelter from the harsh winter winds and a defensible position against potential threats. Thomas had chosen the location with characteristic practicality, but it was Sarah who had subtly influenced certain aspects of the layout, ensuring sightlines remained clear, approaches were visible from multiple angles, and escape routes remained accessible. At the time, Thomas had attributed her suggestions to a woman's concern for safety in frontier countries. Only now did Sarah reflect on how instinctively she had applied her performer's understanding of spatial relationships and her shooter's awareness of tactical positioning. "Riders approaching from the south," called Jackson's son Robert from his position at the fence line. Single file, moving cautiously, Sarah returned to the main yard, retrieving her Winchester with smooth efficiency. Through her spyglass, she identified the lead rider immediately, Sheriff Daniel Parker, his silver badge catching the morning light. Behind him rode 4 deputies, their posture suggesting alertness bordering on tension. "Interesting timing," murmured Eli, who had appeared at her side. "Convenient," Sarah agreed, her tone neutral, almost as if someone informed them of our plans. The sheriff reined in before the main house, his weathered face arranged in an expression of official concern. At 52, Parker had served as county sheriff for nearly a decade, his tenure coinciding with James Blackwell's rising influence in the region. The connection between these two facts had not escaped Sarah's notice. "Mrs. Hargrove," Parker began, touching the brim of his hat in perfunctory respect. "Heard you're preparing for a drive." "Your information is correct, Sheriff," Sarah replied evenly. 200 heads bound for the Cheyenne stockyards. Parker's gaze swept over the busy ranch yard, noting the armed men, the loaded supply wagons, the prepared mounts. "Quite an operation for a widow to manage." "I've managed more complex endeavors," Sarah said, a subtle edge entering her voice. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "I'm afraid I can't recommend proceeding with your plans, Mrs. Hargrove. There have been several incidents lately, rustling, ambushes. Just yesterday, the Wilson outfit lost nearly half their herd in Thunder Canyon." "So I've heard," Sarah acknowledged. "Fortunately, we're taking the eastern route." Parker's eyes narrowed slightly. "Through Cottonwood Draw? That's mighty difficult terrain, ma'am. Dangerous this time of year." "Your concern for my welfare is touching, Sheriff." Sarah's tone made it clear she recognized his concern for what it was, a thinly veiled attempt to dissuade her from proceeding. "However, my foreman and hands are intimately familiar with the route. Even so, I can't guarantee your safety out there," Parker leaned forward, his voice lowering. "There are elements operating in the territory that don't respect the law." "Is that a fact?" Sarah replied, not phrasing it as a question. "How fortunate that I don't rely exclusively on the law for protection." The subtle threat in her words wasn't lost on Parker, whose jaw tightened perceptibly. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm trying to help you avoid a situation that could turn unfortunate." "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said, reaching down to adjust her. Rifles strapped with deliberate casualness, but Split Pine cattle will be reaching the Cheyenne market on schedule. Unless, of course, you have a legal reason to prevent my use of open range and established trail rights. Parker straightened in his saddle, official dignity reasserting itself. "No legal reason, ma'am, just friendly advice." "Then I thank you for your advice and bid you good day." Sarah's dismissal was polite but firm. "We have preparations to complete before departure." As the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Eli moved to stand beside Sarah. "He'll report directly to Blackwell," he observed quietly. "Counting on it," Sarah replied, watching the retreating figures with calculating eyes. "By nightfall, Blackwell will believe we're taking a defensive posture. More men, more weapons, but still proceeding with the drive via an unexpected route. Aren't we?" "Only partly," Sarah said, a faint smile touching her lips. Sheriff Parker saw exactly what I wanted him to see, a substantial force preparing for a difficult journey. What he didn't see was Maria's youngest boys already moving half our herd through the north pasture breaks, or the false trail Jackson's men laid toward Cottonwood Draw. Understanding dawned on Eli's face. "We're splitting the herd, 100 heads taking the eastern route with most of our visible force. Enough to appear like our main drive," Sarah confirmed. "The other 100, our prime stock, moving north before cutting back to reach the Cheyenne Road beyond Thunder Canyon. And you?" Sarah's expression hardened. "I'll be leading the smaller group through the most dangerous stretch, right where Blackwell's men will eventually realize they need to be." Before Eli could respond, Rebecca Curtis emerged from the main house, her travel clothes exchanged for a simple dress borrowed from Sarah's wardrobe. She moved toward them with determined steps, her expression troubled. "You're deliberately drawing them to you," she stated without preamble, making it clear she had overheard the conversation. Sarah didn't deny it. "I'm ensuring my cattle reach the market while minimizing risk to my people. By placing yourself directly in harm's way," Rebecca's voice rose slightly. "Sarah, these aren't exhibition targets or adoring crowds. These are dangerous men with real bullets who won't hesitate to kill you." "I'm well aware of the distinction," Sarah replied calmly, "just as I'm aware that your brother is among them." Rebecca flinched as if struck. Jack Curtis is Blackwell's new tracker and enforcer," Sarah interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact. "He's helping coordinate attacks on small ranches throughout the territory. Whether he's pulled the trigger himself yet is irrelevant. He's chosen his side." "People can change," Rebecca insisted, desperation edging her voice. "The Jack I know wouldn't become a murderer." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "The Jack you knew was a talented marksman with a tendency to follow stronger personalities. I recognized it when I was teaching him to shoot. His technical skills were excellent, but his judgment was easily influenced. That made him dangerous then. It makes him lethal now." Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. "Please, Sarah, if you encounter him, at least give him a chance to walk away." Sarah studied her old acquaintance for a long moment before responding. "I'll give him exactly the same chance he gives me. That's all I can promise." As Rebecca turned away, struggling to compose herself, Maria Rodriguez approached with urgent news. "My eldest just returned from the North Ridge. 8 riders moved along the Thunder Canyon rim, setting up positions overlooking the main trail. They're dressed as ordinary cowhands, but they're armed like soldiers. Blackwell's not waiting for us to start the drive," Sarah concluded. "He's establishing control points along all the likely routes." "There's more," Maria continued. 2 of the men were placing something along the narrowest section of the canyon trail. Miguel couldn't get close enough to identify it, but dynamite, Sarah finished grimly. They're preparing to trigger a rock slide once the herd is in the canyon. Typical cavalry tactic. Control the high ground, create chaos below, then strike when your enemy is disorganized. Sounds like someone with military experience, Jackson observed, joining their conversation. Jack Curtis served with the 7th Cavalry before joining Buffalo Bill's show, Sarah confirmed. He knows how to coordinate an ambush. The gravity of the situation settled over the group. What had begun as dangerous but straightforward cattle, rustling was evolving into something more calculated and deadly. A coordinated military-style operation designed not just to steal livestock, but to eliminate resistance permanently. Sarah moved toward Midnight's enclosure, her decision made. Eli, you'll lead the main group through Cottonwood Draw as planned. Take most of the men, make plenty of dust, ensure you're visible from a distance. Jackson, your riders provide escort and security. And you? Eli asked, already suspecting. The answer. I'll take Diego, Carlos, and Robert with the smaller herd through Blacktail Pass, Sarah replied, checking Midnight's saddle cinches. It's steeper, narrower, but it bypasses Thunder Canyon completely before rejoining the Cheyenne Road. Blacktail Pass hasn't been used in years, Jackson protested. There's a reason they call it Dead Man's Route, which is precisely why Blackwell's men won't be watching it, Sarah pointed out. Besides, I scouted it thoroughly last spring. It's passable if you know the right approach. Her preparations continued with methodical precision, checking ammunition, securing supplies, verifying the readiness of both groups. Throughout, Sarah maintained a calm efficiency that impressed even those who had worked beside her for years. This wasn't the quiet widow managing her late husband's affairs. This was a woman accustomed to coordinating complex operations where timing and precision meant the difference between success and failure, or life and death. As midday approached, the divided groups prepared for departure. The larger contingent, led by Eli, would leave openly and with considerable visibility, drawing attention deliberately to their eastward movement. The smaller group, with Sarah at its head, would depart quietly through the back pastures, using the land's natural features to conceal their progress until they were well away from the ranch. One last thing, Sarah told Eli as they finalized the arrangements. If you encounter serious resistance, more than you can reasonably handle, abandon the cattle. Get our people to safety. The stock can be replaced, the hands cannot. Eli nodded solemnly. And if you encounter Blackwell's men, or Curtis specifically? Sarah checked her Winchester one final time, the familiar weight of it balanced perfectly in her hands. Then they'll discover that steady-eye Sarah didn't retire. Her skills, she just found different applications for them. As she swung into Midnight's saddle, the stallion dancing sideways with eager energy, Sarah felt a strange calm settling over her. The past 12 years seemed to fall away, her body remembering the precise balance needed for mounted shooting, her mind calculating trajectories and lead times automatically. "Be careful," Rebecca called from the porch, her expression torn between hope and fear. Sarah merely nodded, then turned Midnight toward the north pasture, where the smaller herd waited. With the Rodriguez boys. The sun had reached its zenith, casting short shadows across the Wyoming grasslands as the Split Pine cattle drive began its dangerous journey toward Cheyenne, and toward a confrontation 12 years in the making. Behind her, dust rose from Eli's larger group heading east, creating a visible signal that would draw attention exactly where Sarah wanted it. Ahead lay the treacherous route through territory few dared to travel, and beyond that, the confrontation with Blackwell's forces that had become inevitable the moment they targeted Split Pine Ranch. As Midnight carried her forward, Sarah felt The weight of the custom Colt revolvers at her hips, the Winchester secured in its scabbard, and the specialized ammunition carefully distributed for rapid access. Thomas had asked her to set these tools aside, to become simply a rancher's wife. She had done so out of love for him, believing that chapter of her life closed forever. But as the Wyoming wind caught her hair and midnight's powerful stride ate up the miles, Sarah Hargrove acknowledged a truth she had perhaps always known. The woman who could split a playing card at 50 paces had never truly disappeared. She had simply been waiting for the moment when her skills would serve a purpose beyond entertainment, the moment when they would become the difference between survival and destruction. That moment had arrived. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah guided her small group through the hidden northern passage leading to Blacktail Pass. 100 heads of prime split pine cattle moved with surprising quiet through the narrow ravine, their progress carefully managed by the Rodriguez brothers. Diego and Carlos, though barely out of their teens, handled the stock with an intuitive skill that surpassed many veteran drovers. "They're following well," Robert Jackson observed, bringing his horse alongside Sarah's. "Almost like they sense the need for stealth." Sarah nodded, keeping her voice low. "Cattle aren't as dim as people believe. These animals were raised with careful handling. They respond to confident guidance." The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they moved deeper into the territory few travelers ventured to explore. Blacktail Pass had earned its ominous reputation honestly, a treacherous route through the northern foothills where the Bighorn Mountains thrust upward from the basin floor. 3 years earlier, a family attempting to use the pass as a shortcut had disappeared entirely, their wagon and belongings discovered months later at the bottom of a ravine. No survivors. What most people didn't know, what Sarah had discovered during her solitary explorations after Thomas's death, was that a secondary path existed, invisible to casual observation. It required crossing a seemingly impassable scree slope before revealing itself as a viable, if demanding, trail suitable for experienced handlers and sure-footed stock. "We need to pick up the pace," Sarah instructed as they cleared the first difficult section. "We have 4 hours of daylight left, and we need to reach the upper meadow before dark." Diego nodded, signaling his brother to urge the trailing cattle forward. The herd responded, their pace increasing just enough to make better time without risking a stampede in the confining terrain. They had traveled perhaps 2 more miles when midnight suddenly tensed beneath Sarah, his ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring. Sarah immediately raised her hand, signaling a halt. The horse's instincts for danger had proven invaluable on multiple occasions. She had learned to trust them without question. "What is it?" Robert whispered, his rifle already in his hands. Sarah didn't answer immediately, her attention focused on scanning their surroundings. The narrow pass offered limited visibility ahead, with steep rock walls rising on either side. Perfect ambush territory. "Carlos," she called softly, "circle back and make sure we're not being followed." The younger Rodriguez brother nodded, turning his mount to retrace their path, while Sarah continued to study the terrain ahead. Something wasn't right. A stillness that felt unnatural, an absence of the small sounds that typically populated even this desolate landscape. "Stay with the herd," she instructed Diego and Robert. "Keep them calm and maintain their position." Without waiting for acknowledgement, Sarah guided Midnight forward alone, moving with deliberate caution. The stallion's steps were precise, alert. His powerful muscles coiled beneath her, as if ready to explode into action at her slightest signal. They rounded a bend in the pass, and Sarah immediately spotted what had triggered Midnight's warning instincts. Across the narrow trail ahead lay the carcass of a deer, freshly killed, its throat cut with surgical precision. This was no natural predator's work. The positioning was too deliberate, the placement too calculated. A message, a warning. Sarah's gaze swept the rocky heights above, searching for any movement that might betray a watcher's position. Nothing visible, but her instincts, honed through years of performing before unpredictable crowds and animals. Udi told her they were being observed. Carefully, she dismounted, keeping Midnight between herself and the most likely sniper positions. The Winchester came to her shoulder with familiar ease as she examined the deer more closely. The kill was recent, within the last hour, and the animal had been deliberately arranged across the trail, its sightless eyes oriented toward the direction from which Sarah's group had approached. A horseshoe had been placed on the deer's chest, pressed into the bloodied fur with enough force to leave an imprint. Not just any horseshoe. Sarah recognized the distinctive modified design that Thomas had commissioned from a Denver blacksmith for their stock, featuring the split pine brand incorporated into the metal itself. The message couldn't have been clearer. We know who you are, we know where you're going, and we're waiting. Carlos appeared around the bend, his young face taut with concern. Riders, he reported in a hushed tone. 2, maybe 3 following our trail, keeping their distance, but definitely tracking us. Sarah nodded, processing this information as she remounted. They're herding us, she concluded. Watchers ahead, followers behind. Standard military tactic. Channel your target where you want them to go. What do we do? Carlos asked, his hand resting on his pistol. We continue forward, Sarah decided after a moment's consideration, but not blindly. She pointed to a nearly invisible game trail branching upward from their current position. You and I will scout ahead using that route. Robert and Diego will hold the herd here until we signal it's clear. Carlos nodded, his expression betraying both nervousness and determination. At 19, he was the youngest of the Rodriguez brothers, still building his confidence in dangerous situations. Sarah had specifically chosen him for this drive not only for his rapport with the animals, but because Maria had asked her to make a man of him, to help him develop the same steady resolve his older brothers had acquired. Stay close, match my pace, and remain absolutely silent, Sarah instructed as they urged their horses up the steep incline. And if I signal you to freeze, don't move a muscle, not even to breathe hard. The narrow game trail wound upward, at a precarious angle, forcing them to proceed in single file. Sarah led, her Winchester now unsheathed and ready across her lap. Midnight ascended with sure-footed determination, his breeding for mountain country evident in every careful placement of his hooves. After 20 minutes of grueling climbing, they reached a stone outcropping that provided both cover and a vantage point overlooking the pass below. Sarah dismounted, signaling Carlos to secure the horses while she crawled forward to the edge. From this position, she could see approximately half a mile ahead along their intended route. The pass narrowed dramatically before opening into a small box canyon, a natural holding pen that would force any cattle drive to pause and regroup before continuing through the next challenging section. And there, positioned with tactical precision, waited for their reception committee. 6 riders in nondescript trail clothes, their horses concealed in a natural depression that would be invisible from the path below. 2 men were setting up what appeared to be a rope and pulley system connected to precariously balanced boulders above the narrow exit from the box canyon. Another pair maintained watch on the trail, rifles ready. The remaining 2 were consulting over what Sarah recognized immediately as a map of the region. One of those men was Jack Curtis. Even at this distance, Sarah knew him instantly. The distinctive way he held himself, the familiar gesture as he pushed back his hat to study the map more clearly, some mannerisms remained unchanged despite the passage of years. The young cavalry scout she had mentored had matured into a hardened frontiersman, his frame more solid, his movements more deliberate. "Friends of yours," Carlos whispered, having joined her at the observation point. "Once," Sarah replied, her voice neutral. "A lifetime ago. Through her field glasses, she studied the setup more carefully. The ambush was professionally arranged. The rock slide would block retreat once the herd was in the box canyon, while the positioned men would have clear shots at any drovers attempting to control panicked cattle. Simple, effective, and potentially devastating. They know these cattle will bring top dollar in Cheyenne, Carlos observed. Perfect targets for rustlers. Sarah shook her head slightly. This isn't about stealing cattle. Look how they've positioned themselves. They're preparing to eliminate witnesses, not just take stock. Understanding dawned on Carlos's young face. They mean to kill everyone. And take the herd? That's Blackwell's new approach, Sarah confirmed grimly. No survivors means no one to testify against him later. She watched as Jack Curtis pointed toward the trail entrance, apparently giving instructions to his men. His movements were confident, authoritative, the gestures of someone accustomed to command. Whatever path had brought him to Blackwell's employ, Jack had embraced his role fully. "We need to warn the others," Carlos whispered urgently. "We will," Sarah assured him. "But first, I need to understand exactly what we're facing." She continued her observation, noting each man's position, weapons, and the overall structure of the trap. It was military in its precision, not surprising given Jack's cavalry background, but it also revealed a crucial weakness. The entire ambush depended on the cattle drive, following the obvious path through the box canyon. Any deviation would force the ambushers to abandon their carefully established positions and improvise, and improvisation under pressure was where most plans faltered. "There's another way through," Sarah murmured, her eyes tracing a faint line along the western wall of the pass, a nearly invisible ledge that bypassed the box canyon entirely. It would be treacherous, demanding single-file travel and expert handling, but it was passable. She had discovered it during one of her solitary explorations after Thomas's death. During those quiet rides when she had mapped the surrounding territory with the systematic thoroughness that had once made her. Show performances appear effortless. They retreated from the observation point, returning to where Diego and Robert waited with the herd. Sarah quickly outlined what they had discovered and her proposed alternative route. "That ledge can't be more than 3 feet wide in some places," Robert objected. "One misstep and we lose animals to the ravine below. Better to lose some cattle than all our lives," Sarah replied tragically. "Besides, these are mountain-bred stock. They'll follow a lead steer through terrain that would panic flatland cattle." Diego nodded his agreement. "We have Thunder," he said, referring to the massive lead steer that had earned his name from both his appearance and temperament. "If any animal can navigate that path, it's him." "What about the men watching the main trail?" Carlos asked. "Won't they see us taking the ledge route?" "Not if they're distracted," Sarah replied, a plan already forming in her mind. "Robert, take 30 head back the way we came, then circle around to approach the main trail again, create enough dust and noise to draw their attention, then retreat before they can engage. Meanwhile, Diego, Carlos, and I will move the remaining cattle along the ledge path." Robert frowned. "That leaves you with only 2 hands to manage 70 heads through dangerous terrain." 3, Sarah corrected. "I wasn't just for a show in Buffalo Bill's exhibition. I can handle stock as well as I can shoot." She paused, adding, "Besides, if anyone falls behind or gets into trouble, I'm the best qualified to provide covering fire." Though clearly uncomfortable with the plan, Robert couldn't argue with its logic. They quickly separated the herd, selecting 30 heads for the diversion while preparing the stronger animals for the challenging ledge crossing. 1 hour, Sarah instructed Robert. "Give us 1 hour to get the main herd positioned on the ledge, then create your diversion. Once you've drawn their attention, double back and take the secondary route we mapped yesterday. Meet us at Widow's Creek Crossing by midnight." Robert nodded grimly, accepting a spare box of ammunition from Diego. "And if I encounter serious resistance, retreat immediately," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Your job is a distraction, not engagement. These men are playing for keeps. Don't give them any targets they can hit. As Robert departed with the smaller group, Sarah turned her attention to preparing the main herd for their perilous journey. Thunder, the massive led steer, seemed to sense the importance of his role, his intelligent eyes following Sarah as she approached him. "Easy, old friend," she murmured, running a practiced hand along his flank. "I need your steadiness now more than ever." Handling the steel-horned steer required both confidence and respect, qualities Sarah had developed through years of working with temperamental performance horses. Thomas had often marveled at her ability to communicate with even the most difficult animals, never realizing it was the same skill that had allowed her to control her mouth while performing complex shooting maneuvers at full gallop. With Thunder properly equipped with a lead rope and small bells that would guide the following cattle, Sarah signaled Diego and Carlos to begin moving the herd toward the hidden ledge path. The transition from the main trail required navigating a steep incline that initially caused the cattle to balk, but Thunder's confident ascent eventually convinced the rest to follow. "Single file, maintain even spacing," Sarah instructed the Rodriguez brothers as they reached the narrow ledge. "If any animal panics, let it go rather than risking the entire herd." The ledge path clung to the western canyon wall, providing barely enough width for the cattle to proceed in single file. To their right stretched open air, with a drop of nearly 100 feet to the rocky floor below. Under normal circumstances, no drover would attempt such a route with valuable stock, but these were far from normal circumstances. Sarah positioned herself at the rear of the line, allowing Diego to lead with Thunder, while Carlos maintained position midway through the herd. From this position, she could monitor their overall progress, while maintaining a clear field of fire if threats emerged from behind. The sun had begun its westward descent, casting long shadows across the canyon and creating treacherous patches of light and dark that further complicated their journey. The cattle moved with surprising discipline, following Thunder's lead with more trust than Sarah had dared to hope for. Each hoof placement on the narrow ledge sent small cascades of pebbles tumbling into the void below, constant reminders of the consequences of a misstep. They had successfully traversed perhaps half the ledge route when the distant sounds of Robert's diversion reached them, cattle lowing, hoofbeats, and the distinctive crack of a whip designed to create maximum noise rather than actually strike animals. Sarah paused, watching as dust rose from the main trail leading into the box canyon. The reaction from Blackwell's men was immediate. Through her field glasses, Sarah observed 4 riders hurrying to intercept what they believed to be the main herd, leaving only 2 men, including Jack Curtis, at the ambush site. The strategy was working exactly as planned until one of the cattle on the ledge lost its footing. The young steer, startled by the echoing sounds of the diversion, stumbled on a loose section of the path. Its desperate scramble to regain balance sent a shower of rocks cascading into the canyon below, creating a distinctive pattern of sound that immediately drew attention. Sarah watched as Jack Curtis turned toward their position, his head cocked. In the listening posture she remembered so well from their time together in the show. Even at this distance, she could read his body language, the sudden alertness, the predatory stillness as he processed what he was hearing. Then his gaze locked directly on their position along the ledge. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, Sarah found herself staring through her field glasses at the man she had once considered a friend, a protégé, someone she had taught the very skills he was now employing against her. She couldn't see his expression clearly at this distance, but she didn't need to. The immediate reaching for his rifle told her everything. "Keep moving," she called to Diego and Carlos. "Don't stop for anything." The first shot cracked against the rock face several feet from their position, a ranging shot from a marksman. Assessing distance and wind conditions, the second came closer, chipping stone splinters that startled the nearest cattle. Sarah didn't hesitate. Bringing her Winchester to her shoulder in one fluid motion, she sighted and fired in return. not aiming to hit Jack or his companion, but targeting the rope system they had rigged for their rockslide trap. The heavy rope parted under her. Precise shot, sending the carefully balanced boulders tumbling prematurely into the box canyon below, cutting off the direct route between the ambushes and the main trail. The distant shouts of confusion confirmed the effectiveness of her countermove. Jack would recognize the shooting style immediately. Few people in the territory could make such a shot at that range, but it would buy them precious minutes to clear the most exposed section of the ledge path. "They'll circle around," Sarah called to the Rodriguez brothers as they urged the cattle forward with renewed urgency. "We need to reach the northern end of the pass before they intercept us." The herd's pace increased as they neared the wider section where the ledge gradually expanded into a proper trail again. Thunder led with confident steps, the rest of the cattle following with the single-minded focus of animals who sensed danger and trusted their leaders to guide them to safety. Behind them, Sarah heard the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Jack and his companion had abandoned their position and were racing to cut off the herd's escape from the northern end of the pass. It would be a close race, with the outcome determined by minutes rather than hours. As the last of the cattle cleared the narrowest section of the ledge, Sarah allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Blackwell's carefully planned ambush had failed, at least this initial attempt. The warning signs had been recognized and countered. The trap sprung harmlessly, but she harbored no illusions about what lay ahead. Jack Curtis knew her identity now, and Blackwell would soon learn that he wasn't facing an ordinary widow struggling to maintain her late husband's ranch. The conflict had escalated from a simple cattle-rustling operation to something more personal, more dangerous. "Diego," she called as they reached more favorable terrain. "Take the lead with Thunder. Carlos and I will cover the rear. Make for the North Meadow as fast as you can safely drive them." The older Rodriguez brother nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Their brief advantage of surprise and stealth had evaporated. Now it was a matter of speed and endurance, reaching defensible ground before their pursuers could organize a coordinated attack. Sarah fell back to the rear of the herd, Winchester ready as she scanned their back trail for signs of pursuit. The sun now hung low in the western sky, painting the rugged landscape in fiery hues of orange and gold. Beautiful, if one had the luxury to appreciate it. Currently, it meant the coming challenge of navigating unfamiliar territory in fading light, with hostile forces in close pursuit. "Miss Sarah," Carlos called softly, pointing toward a dust cloud rising beyond the northern ridge. "More riders." Through her field glasses, Sarah counted at least 8 men, approaching rapidly from the direction of their intended escape route. Blackwell had positioned forces to block both ends of the pass, creating a pincer movement designed to trap them completely. "Change of plans," she announced, making a rapid calculation. "We head for Dead Man's Hollow." Carlos's eyes widened. "The box canyon, but there's no way out except the entrance." "There's one way," Sarah corrected, "if you know where to look. And fortunately for us, I do." As midnight carried her forward, to relay the new directions to Diego, Sarah found herself reflecting on the irony of their situation. Jack Curtis had designed an ambush based on trapping them in a box canyon. Now, she was deliberately leading their precious cargo into exactly such a formation, but one whose secrets she had discovered during those lonely rides after Thomas's death, when the solitude of the mountains had provided both comfort and purpose. Dead Man's Hollow had earned its ominous name honestly. A deep canyon, accessible through a single narrow entrance, its sheer walls rising hundreds of feet on all sides. Most travelers avoided it entirely, considering it a death trap. What they didn't know, what Sarah had discovered quite by accident, was that a narrow crevice at the far end led to a hidden valley beyond, containing both water and grazing land. If they could reach the hollow before Blackwell's forces converged, they might yet salvage their drive and their lives. But everything now depended on timing. on Sarah's precise knowledge of the terrain and on the skills she had spent years perfecting in a very different arena. As the shadows lengthened across the Wyoming wilderness, the high-stakes chase continued. A widow with extraordinary abilities, leading her small band against overwhelming odds, with 200 miles of dangerous country still lying between them and safety. Behind them, Jack Curtis pursued with the relentless focus that had once made him a promising cavalry scout. Ahead waited Blackwell's forces, confident in their superior numbers and positioning. And somewhere between these threats, Robert Jackson raced with his diversionary herd, unaware that the planned rendezvous point was now unreachable. The chess pieces were in motion, the board rapidly shifting. And Sarah Hargrove, who had once calculated complex shooting trajectories for the entertainment of crowds, now applied those same analytical skills to a deadlier game, one where the stakes were not applause, but survival. Night had fallen by. The time Sarah's group reached Dead Man's Hollow, a yawning void in the earth that opened suddenly among the rolling foothills. The cattle moved reluctantly toward the narrow entrance, their natural instincts warning against entering such a confined space. Only Thunder's steady leadership and the skillful guidance of the Rodriguez brothers prevented the herd from balking completely. "We'll rest here briefly," Sarah announced, as the last of the cattle passed into the relative safety of the hollow. "The horses need water, and we need to regroup before continuing." Carlos dismounted stiffly, his young face drawn with fatigue. "What about Robert? He'll head for Widow's Creek as planned." "I'll send up a signal once we're secure," Sarah replied, surveying the towering walls that surrounded them. The hollow formed a natural amphitheater, with sheer cliffs rising on all sides, except for the narrow entrance through which they had come. Moonlight silvered the upper rim, but the floor remained in deep shadow, offering concealment from distant observers. As Diego tended to the nervous cattle, Sarah led Midnight to a small spring that bubbled from the base of the eastern wall. The stallion drank deeply, his black coat gleaming like liquid shadow in the faint moonlight. Sarah ran a practiced hand along his neck, feeling the powerful muscles that had carried her unflaggingly through the day's ordeal. "Your father would be proud," she murmured, thoughts of Thomas momentarily overwhelming her tactical focus. "He always said you'd prove yourself when it mattered most." The sound of loose stones scattering down the canyon wall interrupted her reflection. Sarah's Winchester was in her hands instantly, aimed toward the disturbance before conscious thought could even register the movement. "Still quick on the draw, I see." The voice emerged from the shadows near the crevice at the back of the hollow. A voice Sarah recognized immediately, despite the years that separated their last encounter. "Jack," she acknowledged, not lowering her rifle, "I was wondering when you'd make your appearance." Jack Curtis stepped into a patch of moonlight, his hands deliberately held away from the revolvers at his hips. At 36, he carried himself with the weary confidence of a man accustomed to hard country and harder choices. His face, once boyishly handsome, had weathered into rugged planes and angles that spoke of years spent outdoors in all conditions. "Your sister warned me you were working for Blackwell," Sarah continued, her aim unwavering. "I had hoped she was mistaken." Jack's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile or a grimace. Rebecca always did talk too much. Though in this case, she wasn't entirely wrong. "I am working in the territory, organizing ambushes against small ranchers, setting traps for cattle drives. That's a far cry from the cavalry scout I knew, Jack." He shrugged, the gesture almost casual. "Times change, people change." "The fundamentals don't," Sarah countered. "Right and wrong remain consistent, regardless of how you dress them up." Diego and Carlos had noticed the intruder now, both moving to flank Sarah with weapons ready. Jack assessed them with a professional eye, but made no threatening moves. "Stand easy, boys," Sarah instructed without taking her eyes off Jack. "Mr. Curtis and I are old acquaintances." "Acquaintances?" Jack echoed, a hint of bitterness entering his voice. Is that what we were, Sarah? Just acquaintances. The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken history. Sarah's mind travelled back involuntarily to another time, another place, to the first time she had met Jack Curtis, a promising young cavalry scout assigned as a liaison. To Buffalo Bill's Wild West show during their St. Louis engagement. Miss Mitchell, Colonel Cody asked me to deliver these specifications for the new targets. Sarah looked up from checking her custom rifle to find a young man in cavalry uniform, standing at the entrance to her tent, a rolled document in his hands. His posture was military precise, but his eyes held undisguised curiosity as they took in the array of weapons arranged on her portable workbench. Thank you, Lieutenant. Curtis. Jack Curtis. Actually, I'm just a scout, not an officer. He stepped forward, offering the papers with a slight bow that seemed at odds with his frontier appearance. Been assigned as liaison between the fort and the show while you're in St. Louis. Sarah accepted the documents, noting the way the young man's gaze lingered on her modified Winchester. You're interested in firearms, Mr. Curtis. A boyish enthusiasm briefly overtook his professional demeanor. Yes, ma'am, especially precision shooting. I've heard stories about your abilities, but some of the claims seemed exaggerated? Sarah supplied a knowing smile. The show does tend toward theatricality. Curtis's cheeks colored slightly. I meant no disrespect. None taken. Sarah lifted the Winchester, offering it to him. This is my primary performance weapon. Custom action, specialized balance weight in the stock, and sights I modified myself. Would you care to examine it? The young scout accepted the rifle with reverent hands, his trained eye immediately assessing its unique features. This isn't just for show, he observed. The modifications are all practical. I don't believe in sacrificing function for appearance, Sarah confirmed. Every alteration serves a purpose. Improved accuracy, reduced recoil, faster target acquisition. Curtis nodded appreciatively, returning the weapon with reluctance. They say you can hit a dime tossed in the air from 50 paces. Is that true? On a good day with proper light, Sarah replied modestly. Would you like a demonstration? His face lit up with undisguised eagerness. If it wouldn't be an imposition, ma'am. Not at all. I could use some practice before tonight's performance. Sarah gathered several rifles and a box of ammunition. And perhaps you might show me some of your own skills. I understand cavalry scouts must be proficient marksmen. I'm considered fair with a rifle, Curtis admitted, though nothing approaching. Your reputation, Sarah's laugh was warm and genuine. Reputations are often more impressive than reality, Mr. Curtis. Let's see what you can do. They spent the afternoon behind the main exhibition grounds, where Sarah had established a private practice range. Curtis proved to be an excellent natural shot, with solid fundamentals but room for improvement in his technique. Sarah found herself offering pointers almost automatically, correcting his stance, adjusting his grip, teaching him to control his breathing more effectively. You've increased your accuracy by nearly 30%, she observed after an hour of practice. You have a natural talent, Mr. Curtis, the young scout beamed at her praise. Thank you, ma'am, though I still couldn't hit half the shots you make look effortless. That comes with years of dedicated practice, Sarah told him. I started shooting competitively when I was 12. My father believed women should be able to defend themselves in this world, a somewhat unconventional view for a Boston banker. Curtis raised an eyebrow. Boston? I would have guessed you were Western-born. The persona of Steady-Eye Sarah is frontier through and through, she acknowledged with a wry smile. The reality of Sarah Mitchell is somewhat more complicated. I'd like to hear that story sometime, Curtis said, his admiration evident. Sarah studied him thoughtfully. There was something genuinely appealing about the young scout's enthusiasm and respect, qualities often lacking in the men she encountered, both in the show and in society at large. "Perhaps you will, Mr. Curtis. We'll be in St. Louis for 3 weeks after all." She lifted her specialized Winchester. "Now, about that dime-toss demonstration." The memory faded as Sarah refocused on the man standing before her. So different from the eager young scout who had hung on her every word during those St. Louis practices. The intervening years had hardened him, yes, but there was something else in his bearing now, a calculated coldness that had been entirely absent in the Jack Curtis she had known. "We were colleagues," she said finally, answering his question. "Perhaps friends for a time." "You were my mentor," Jack countered, his voice quiet but intense. "Everything I know about precision shooting, about reading wind and distance, about maintaining focus under pressure, I learned from you. And now you're using those skills to terrorize small ranchers and steal cattle," Sarah observed, her tone deliberately neutral. "Is that what you envisioned for yourself when you asked me to teach you?" A flicker of something, regret, defensiveness, crossed Jack's weathered features. "Life takes unexpected turns, Sarah. After I left the cavalry, there weren't many opportunities for a man with my particular talents." "And there are always choices," Sarah replied. Even in the hardest circumstances, Jack's laugh held no humor. Says the woman who chose to disappear into domestic obscurity, the legendary steady-eye Sarah reduced to branding calves and mending fences on a forgotten Wyoming ranch. Some choices. The barb struck deeper than Sarah would have admitted, echoing doubts she herself had harbored during the early years of her marriage. Thomas had wanted a wife, not a celebrity sharpshooter. He had admired her skills in the abstract, but had been uncomfortable with the attention they attracted. Gradually, Sarah Mitchell had faded into Mrs. Thomas Hargrove, her exceptional abilities, becoming family law rather than public spectacle, until now. "I chose love," Sarah said simply. "What's your excuse for choosing Blackwell?" Jack's expression hardened. "James Blackwell recognizes and rewards talent. He's building something significant in this territory, something that will bring order and progress to a chaotic frontier by eliminating anyone who stands in his way," Sarah challenged. "By destroying families who've worked these lands for generations?" "Progress has costs," Jack replied with a shrug. "The small operators can't compete in the changing market. Blackwell offers fair prices for their land, more than they'd get elsewhere." "Fair prices?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "Like the fair price he offered for Split Pine after Thomas died, 1/5 its actual value." Jack's gaze shifted away momentarily. "I wasn't involved in that negotiation." "But you're involved now," Sarah pressed. "Organizing ambushes, planning rock slides to wipe out entire cattle drives. When did you cross the line from cavalry scout to outright murderer, Jack?" The accusation hung in the air between them, unanswered. Diego and Carlos remained tense, their weapons trained on the intruder despite Sarah's earlier instruction to stand down. "I didn't come here to argue ethics," Jack said finally. "I came to offer you a way out." Sarah's eyebrow raised slightly. "I'm listening." "Blackwell has 20 men surrounding this hollow," Jack informed her. "The entrance is blocked, and they're preparing to move in at first light. But I convinced him that killing a woman, especially one with your particular background, would attract unwanted attention." "How considerate," Sarah remarked dryly. Jack ignored the sarcasm. "He's authorized me to offer you terms. Leave the cattle and clear out of the territory entirely. In exchange, you and your hands walk away unharmed. Blackwell will even pay you half market value for the Split Pine. Generous, considering your position. And if I refuse?" Jack's expression grew somber. "Then what happens at dawn won't be on my conscience. Blackwell's new men aren't as discriminating as I might prefer." Sarah studied him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his right hand unconsciously strayed toward his Remington before forcing itself to stillness again. Jack Curtis might be working for Blackwell, but he wasn't entirely comfortable with his employer's methods, at least where she was concerned. "You really believe Blackwell would honor such an agreement?" she asked. "After what happened to Thomas?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" "Thomas didn't die in a hunting accident," Sarah stated flatly. "He was shot in the back while checking our northern fence line the day after he rejected Blackwell's final offer for the ranch." "That's a serious accusation," Jack replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Do you have proof?" "The bullet," Sarah said simply. "I dug it out of him myself when I found his body. Winchester, 44-40, not a common hunting round in these parts, and fired from over 200 yards, based on the entry angle." A long silence followed her statement, broken only by the soft lowing of cattle further back in the hollow. "I'm sorry about Thomas," Jack finally said, and the sincerity in his voice seemed genuine. "But that doesn't change your current situation. You're outnumbered and trapped. Take the offer, Sarah, for old time's sake." Sarah's mind worked rapidly, processing options and variables. Jack's presence here, alone and apparently unsanctioned by his companions, suggested possibilities. His warning about Blackwell's forces was likely accurate, but his claim about their readiness to attack at dawn might be strategic misdirection. "I need to think about it," she said, lowering her Winchester slightly. A calculated gesture of consideration rather than surrender. "Give me until midnight for an answer." Jack hesitated, clearly suspicious of the delay. "Blackwell expects my report sooner." "Then tell him I'm considering his generous offer," Sarah suggested. "But remind him that even a cornered animal is dangerous, especially one with my particular skills." The implicit threat wasn't lost on Jack. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Midnight, then. I'll return your decision." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "One more thing, Jack. Did Rebecca find you?" He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Yes. She came to Blackwell's camp yesterday, full of dire warnings about redemption and choosing the right path." A hint of the younger, more vulnerable Jack Curtis showed through his hardened exterior. "Always was the moral compass of the family, my sister." "She cares about you," Sarah observed quietly. "Care doesn't put food on the table or bullets in your gun," Jack replied, the momentary softness vanishing. "Midnight, Sarah. Don't try anything foolish before then." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him an excellent cavalry scout and now made him a dangerous adversary. When she was certain he had gone, Sarah turned to the Rodriguez brothers. "Get the cattle ready to move," she instructed in a hushed tone. "We leave in 1 hour." Carlos looked confused. "But the entrance is blocked. You heard him say Blackwell's men are surrounding us." "The main entrance, yes," Sarah agreed. "But there's another way out of this hollow that very few people know exists." Diego's eyes widened in understanding. "The crevice you mentioned, at the back wall," Sarah nodded. "It leads to a narrow passage that eventually opens into Highland Valley, completely bypassing the routes Blackwell's men will be watching." "Can the cattle fit through?" Carlos asked doubtfully. "Single file, with careful handling," Sarah confirmed. "I mapped the route 3 years ago after discovering it by accident. Thomas thought I was being excessive, documenting every trail and passage in the region, but—" She trailed off, memories of her late husband's gentle teasing about her strategic mind briefly overwhelming her. Diego placed a sympathetic hand on her shoulder. "Mr. Hargrove would be proud to see how you're using that knowledge now." Sarah straightened, pushing the memories aside to focus on their immediate challenges. "We need to move quickly and quietly. The passage is dark, with several tight turns. Each of us will lead a section of the herd, maintaining contact by sound rather than sight." As the brothers moved to prepare the cattle, Sarah took a moment to check on Midnight. The stallion had recovered well from the day's exertions, his powerful frame ready for the challenges ahead. She stroked his neck absently, her mind returning to the conversation with Jack Curtis. There had been something in his manner, something beyond his stated purpose, that nagged at her instincts. Jack had always been an excellent shot, but his true talents lay in tracking and reconnaissance. If Blackwell merely wanted to deliver an ultimatum, he could have sent any messenger, sending Jack specifically, allowing him to approach her alone. "He was assessing our defenses," she murmured, the realization crystallizing suddenly, counting our weapons, our ammunition, looking for weaknesses. But Jack had also revealed crucial information, whether intentionally or not. 20 men surrounding the hollow meant Blackwell had concentrated his forces here, likely pulling men from other positions throughout the territory. If Sarah and her small group could slip away undetected through the hidden passage, they would face significantly reduced opposition for the remainder of their journey to Cheyenne. The question that troubled her was whether Jack truly believed she would consider Blackwell's offer, or if he suspected she had an alternative escape route. The Jack Curtis she had known years ago had been observant and intuitive, qualities that would have only sharpened with time and experience. "You're holding back," Jack observed as they concluded their daily practice session. After 3 weeks of intensive training, he had developed an eye for Sarah's techniques that few others possessed. "That last sequence, you adjusted your stance just before firing. Why?" Sarah smiled, impressed by his perception. "The target shifted slightly in the breeze. I compensated automatically, but there was barely any wind," Jack protested. "There's always wind, Jack," Sarah replied, beginning to clean her rifle with practiced movements. "Sometimes it's just a matter of reading the subtlest signs, a flutter in a distant flag, the way dust motes catch the light, the feel of air against your cheek. Shooting isn't just about the moment you pull the trigger. It's about understanding everything that happens between you and your target." Jack nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom as he had all her other lessons, with genuine appreciation and respect. "I've learned more from you in 3 weeks than in years with the cavalry's best marksman." "You're a natural talent," Sarah told him sincerely. "With continued practice you could become exceptional." A comfortable silence fell between them as they packed up the shooting equipment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the practice range, marking the approaching end of another day and the approaching end of Buffalo Bill's engagement in St. Louis. "Will you write?" Jack asked suddenly, the question clearly one he had been considering for some time. "After the show moves on," Sarah paused in her methodical packing. "Would you like me to?" "Very much," he admitted, a hint of color touching his tanned cheeks. "I've never met anyone quite like you, Miss Mitchell. Your skill, your confidence, your approach to life, they're extraordinary." The earnestness in his voice touched something in Sarah. At 24, she had grown accustomed to admiration for her shooting abilities, but genuine appreciation for her character was rarer. Jack Curtis, 7 years her junior, had approached their sessions with a refreshing absence of male ego or territorial defensiveness. "I would be happy to correspond," she told him with a warm smile. "Though I should warn you that the show's schedule makes regular communication challenging." Jack's face brightened. "I understand. Even occasional letters would be welcome." He hesitated before adding, "I've received new orders. I'm being transferred to frontier duty in the Dakota Territory next month." A challenging assignment, Sarah observed, knowing the tensions in that region, but one that will utilize your tracking skills effectively. "I hope to make a name for myself," Jack admitted, "perhaps establish connections that might lead to opportunities beyond the military." "Such as?" Jack's expression grew animated as he outlined his ambitions. "The territories are changing rapidly," Men with the right skills and connections will help shape the new West. I don't want to just witness that transformation. I want to be part of it." Sarah nodded, recognizing the genuine passion behind his words. "With your abilities and determination, I have no doubt you'll find your place in that future." She offered her hand formally. "And I look forward to hearing of your successes, Lieutenant Curtis." Jack took her hand, holding it perhaps a moment longer than strictly proper. "I'm not a lieutenant yet, Miss Mitchell." "You will be," Sarah predicted, with certainty. "I recognize ambition when I see it." The memory faded as Carlos approached with news that the cattle were ready to move. Sarah checked her watch, a delicate timepiece that had been Thomas's wedding gift to her, its practical elegance characteristic of his understanding of her preferences. "We have 40 minutes before Jack returns," she noted. "Let's use them wisely." Leading Midnight toward the rear of the hollow, Sarah approached the seemingly solid rock wall that formed its back boundary. In the darkness, the narrow crevice that provided their escape route was nearly invisible. A jagged slash in the stone that appeared too small for a person to pass through, much less cattle. "It widens about 10 feet in," Sarah explained, striking a match to light a small lantern. "The passage beyond is narrow but navigable. Thunder goes first. He'll create the path, the others will follow naturally." Diego nodded, guiding the massive lead steer toward the hidden entrance. The animal balked initially, but Diego's gentle persistence and Sarah's calm assurance eventually convinced him to push through the tight opening. "Carlos, you'll follow with the first 30 heads," Sarah instructed. "Diego continues leading with Thunder. I'll bring up the rear with the remaining cattle once you're safely through the narrowest section." As they methodically began moving the herd through the concealed passage, Sarah maintained a vigilant watch on the hollow entrance. Jack Curtis had claimed he would return at midnight, but her instincts warned that Blackwell might not be as patient, especially if he suspected deception. The cattle moved with surprising cooperation, their natural herd instinct compelling them to follow Thunder's confident lead through the unfamiliar terrain. The passage twisted and turned, occasionally requiring the drovers to encourage hesitant animals through particularly tight sections. Sarah continually glanced at her watch. As the minutes ticked away, nearly half the herd had entered the passage when a distant sound caught her attention, the soft nicker of a horse quickly silenced. Someone was approaching the hollow, hours ahead of the midnight meeting. "Keep moving them through," she whispered to Carlos as she handed him the lantern. "Don't stop for anything." Taking only her Winchester and a small pouch of ammunition, Sarah moved silently toward the hollow entrance, positioning herself behind a large boulder that offered both concealment and a clear field of fire. Midnight, trained to remain quietly, where left stood motionless in the shadows nearby. The minutes stretched as Sarah waited, every sense alert for further signs of approach. Her breathing slowed automatically, her body settling into the calm, focused state that had once allowed her to make seemingly impossible shots before cheering crowds. The showmanship had been for the audience. This predatory stillness had always been for herself, the core of her talent that no one, not even Thomas, had fully understood. A shadow moved at the hollow entrance, then another. Men entering cautiously, rifles ready. Not Jack Curtis, but Blackwell's other hired guns, attempting to secure the position ahead of schedule. Sarah remained perfectly still, counting silently as more figures slipped into the hollow. 5, 6, 7 in total, moving with military precision to establish a perimeter. They would discover the cattle missing within minutes. Sarah needed to buy time for Diego and Carlos to get the remainder of the herd through the hidden passage. Taking careful aim at a stack of loose rocks on the far side of the hollow, she fired a single, precise shot. The resulting cascade created enough noise to draw the intruder's attention away from the rear wall. In the momentary confusion, Sarah fired twice more, not aiming to hit the men, but placing her shots close enough to force them to seek cover. "It's a trap!" one of them shouted, diving behind a boulder as Sarah's next shot kicked up dirt inches from his position. The hollow erupted into chaos as Blackwell's men returned fire, shooting blindly toward the origin of Sarah's shots, while she had already shifted position. With methodical precision, she continued to place targeted shots around the intruders, creating the impression of multiple defenders firing from different locations. The distraction worked. As Blackwell's men focused on the phantom threat, Carlos successfully guided the last of the cattle through the hidden passage. Only Sarah and Midnight remained in the hollow, maintaining the illusion of a fortified defense. With the herd safely through, Sarah executed the final phase of her impromptu plan. A precisely aimed shot at a precariously balanced boulder high on the hollow wall sent it crashing down, triggering a miniature avalanche that partially blocked the hollow entrance. Not enough to trap Blackwell's men inside, but sufficient to complicate any immediate pursuit. In the resulting dust and confusion, Sarah mounted Midnight and raced for the hidden passage, the stallion navigating the difficult entrance with the agility that made him exceptional. By the time Blackwell's men realized what had happened, Sarah and the entire herd were well into the twisting passage that would lead them to Highland Valley, and to an open route towards Cheyenne that Blackwell's forces weren't prepared to monitor. As she urged Midnight through the narrow confines, Sarah found herself wondering what Jack Curtis would think when he returned at midnight to find an empty hollow and frustrated companions. Had he truly expected her to consider Blackwell's offer, or had he secretly hoped she would find another way out? The Jack Curtis she had known years ago would have appreciated the tactical elegance of her escape. The man he had become might view it very differently, as a personal affront, a challenge to his professional reputation. Either way, Sarah harbored no illusions that this night's work had ended their confrontation. It had merely elevated it to a new level. James Blackwell's camp sprawled across a sheltered valley 2 miles south of Thunder Canyon. Unlike the makeshift arrangements typical of cattle outfits, this operation displayed military efficiency in its organization. Tents arranged in precise rows, horses corralled in secure pens, armed men patrolling the perimeter at regular intervals. Lanterns illuminated the central area where a large canvas pavilion served as headquarters. Inside this command tent, James Blackwell studied the crude map spread across a folding table, his manicured fingers tracing the route where his men had failed to intercept the split pine herd. At 54, Blackwell cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, his silver-streaked black hair and neatly trimmed beard giving him the appearance of frontier royalty. His clothing, though appropriate for the territory, was clearly of Eastern quality, from his tailored shirt to the custom-made boots that had never known the indignity of actual ranch work. "Explain to me," he said, his cultured voice carrying the faintest hint of a Virginia accent, "how a widow and 2 Mexican boys managed to outmaneuver 20 of my best men." The question was directed at the dust-covered rider who had just delivered news of the hollow fiasco. The man shifted uncomfortably, aware that Blackwell's soft tone often preceded his most dangerous moments. "Sir, they had an escape route we didn't know about, some kind of hidden passage at the back of the hollow." "And Curtis?" Blackwell inquired, still studying the map rather than looking at his subordinate. "Where was he during this embarrassment?" "He returned to the hollow at midnight as planned, sir. By then, the widow and the cattle were long gone." Blackwell's eyes finally lifted, cold blue and calculating. How convenient. The flap of the tent opened, admitting Jack Curtis. Unlike the other men in Blackwell's employ, he entered without waiting for permission, his manner suggesting a position above ordinary hired guns. Dust caked his clothing, and a fresh tear in his sleeve indicated a close encounter with the rocky terrain. "I tracked them to Highland Valley," Jack announced without preamble. "They're moving north-northeast, following the ridgeline toward Carter's Crossing." Blackwell studied Curtis carefully, his expression unreadable. "You told me the widow would consider our offer. Instead, she made fools of my men and disappeared with her entire herd." Jack met his employer's gaze without flinching. "I underestimated her resourcefulness. It won't happen again." "No," Blackwell agreed softly. "It won't, because this time you'll handle the matter personally, with a clear understanding of the consequences should you fail again." A tense silence followed this pronouncement. The other men in the tent studiously avoided looking at either Blackwell or Curtis, aware they were witnessing a power struggle whose outcome could prove fatal for the loser. "Sarah Hargrove isn't an ordinary widow," Jack finally said, breaking the silence. "She was once known as Steady Eye Sarah, the premier trick shooter in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. I watched her split playing cards at 50 paces and hit moving targets while riding at full gallop." Blackwell's eyebrow raised slightly, the first indication of genuine surprise he had shown. "You neglected to mention this previously." "I only confirmed her identity tonight," Jack replied. "But it explains her tactical thinking and exceptional shooting skills. It also explains why my offer was rejected so decisively," Blackwell mused, turning back to the map. "A woman with that background wouldn't frighten easily." His finger traced the Highland Valley route, stopping at Carter's Crossing, a notorious bottleneck where the trail narrowed between steep cliffs and treacherous river rapids. "She'll have to funnel her cattle through here," he noted. "No alternative routes for miles in either direction." "My thoughts exactly," Jack confirmed. "With your permission, I'll take 10 men and establish a position ahead of their arrival. The terrain provides perfect ambush opportunities." Blackwell studied Curtis with renewed interest. "You seem eager to confront this woman. Is there something personal in this matter, Jack?" Curtis maintained his professional demeanor, though a muscle in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I simply prefer to correct my own mistakes." "Admirable," Blackwell remarked dryly, "though one wonders if your history with the famous Steady Eye Sarah might complicate matters." Jack's expression hardened. "My history makes me the ideal person to anticipate her next move." "Perhaps," Blackwell conceded. "Take your men and secure Carter's Crossing. But remember, I need those cattle and that land. The widow's fate is secondary, though preferable if she simply disappeared." The implied instruction hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Jack nodded once, turned on his heel, and departed to assemble his team, leaving Blackwell to continue his study of the map. When the tent had cleared of all but his most trusted lieutenant, Frank Mercer, Blackwell poured himself a measure of expensive bourbon from a crystal decanter that seemed absurdly out of place in the frontier camp. "Curtis knows her," Mercer observed, accepting a smaller portion when offered. "Better than he's admitting." "Obviously," Blackwell agreed, swirling the amber liquid contemplatively. "The question is whether that knowledge makes him more effective or more dangerous to our operation." Mercer, a former Pinkerton detective whose moral flexibility had proven more profitable than law enforcement, leaned over the map. "You really need the split pine that badly? Seems like a lot of trouble for one ranch." "It's not just a ranch," Blackwell corrected, his tone taking on the quality of a professor educating a particularly slow student. "It's the final piece in a strategic puzzle. Once Split Pine is secured, we control every water source in the Eastern Valley. Without access to water, the smaller operations to the south become unviable, forcing them to sell," Mercer concluded. "Precisely." Blackwell's finger traced a line connecting various properties already under his control. "The Governor's Railroad Commission will announce the new spur line's route next month. Once that news becomes public, land values along the proposed track will quadruple overnight. Understanding dawned on Mercer's face. And you'll already own everything worth having. The territories are transforming, Frank, Blackwell said, his voice taking on a rare note of genuine passion. The days of small ranchers and frontier individualism are ending. The future belongs to men with vision and organization, men who understand how to consolidate resources and maximize efficiency. Men like you, Mercer supplied dutifully. Men like us, Blackwell corrected with unusual generosity. Provided we handle this Hargrove situation permanently, he returned to the map, studying the terrain between his current position and Carter's Crossing. The woman's proving more troublesome than anticipated, but that changes nothing. Whether it's this drive or the next, Split Pine will fall. Thomas Hargrove understood this reality toward the end. It's unfortunate his widow requires a more forceful education. The casual reference to Thomas Hargrove's death hung in the air, neither acknowledged nor denied. Mercer had been with Blackwell long enough to understand which questions remained unasked. What about Curtis? He inquired instead. Can he be trusted to handle her? Blackwell sipped his bourbon, considering. Jack is ambitious and practical, qualities I appreciate, but he's also prideful, and this woman represents a connection to his past that may complicate his judgment. Want me to send some additional men? Insurance? No, Blackwell decided after a moment. Let's see how he handles this test. If he succeeds, his loyalty becomes more assured. If he fails or hesitates... He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. And Sheriff? Parker? Mercer asked. He's getting nervous about the recent activities. Blackwell's smile held no warmth. The good sheriff's re-election campaign receives generous funding from concerned citizens interested in maintaining law and order. His nervousness is noted but irrelevant. A rider approached the tent, requesting permission to enter. When admitted, he handed Blackwell a telegram that had just arrived from Cheyenne. Blackwell read it quickly, his expression darkening. It seems our operation has attracted unwanted attention. Judge Morrison is dispatching federal marshals to investigate reports of organized cattle theft in the territory. Mercer swore softly. Morrison's not one of ours. No, Blackwell agreed grimly, which makes our timetable more urgent. Curtis needs to resolve the Hargrove situation immediately, before federal involvement complicates matters. He scribbled a message on paper and handed it to the waiting rider. Deliver this to Curtis at Carter's Crossing. Tell him circumstances have changed. The Split Pine matter must be concluded within 48 hours, by whatever means necessary. As the rider departed, Blackwell turned back to the map, his finger tracing the route to Cheyenne. If Sarah Hargrove reaches the territorial capital with her cattle and her story intact, she'll find sympathetic ears. That cannot happen. And if Curtis fails, Mercer asked, Blackwell's blue eyes turned glacial. Then we implement more direct measures. The woman's exceptional shooting skills are impressive, but irrelevant against certain final solutions. The implication hung in the air as Blackwell calmly finished his bourbon, his methodical mind already calculating contingencies and alternatives. Like a chess master seeing moves beyond the current board, he visualized the territory's future, a future where men like James Blackwell controlled not just land and cattle, but the very infrastructure of civilization pushing inexorably westward. One stubborn widow with a rifle, no matter how talented, would not derail that vision. The morning sun crested the eastern ridge as Sarah's cattle drive approached Carter's Crossing, illuminating the treacherous terrain ahead. The trail narrowed dramatically between towering cliffs on one side and the rushing waters of the Powder River on the other, creating a natural bottleneck that had claimed the lives of careless travelers for generations. Under normal circumstances, it would take several hours to safely navigate a herd this size through the crossing, but these weren't normal circumstances. Sarah reined in midnight at a vantage point overlooking the approach, her experienced eye assessing the terrain with tactical precision. Diego and Carlos joined her, while Robert Jackson, who had successfully reunited with them during the night, remained with the herd. "They'll be waiting for us," Sarah concluded, lowering her field glasses. "Probably positioned along those upper ledges. Perfect firing positions covering the entire crossing." Diego nodded grimly. "No way around?" "Not for the cattle," Sarah confirmed. "A rider might make it through Devil's Gulch to the north, but the herd would never manage those switchbacks." Carlos, who had been studying the crossing with growing concern, suddenly pointed toward a barely visible glint of metal on the eastern cliff face. "There! Someone's up there!" Sarah raised her glasses again, adjusting the focus to examine the position. "Good eye, Carlos. Look out with a rifle, probably the first of many." She continued her methodical survey, identifying at least 3 more positions where Blackwell's men had established concealment. The ambush was professionally arranged, exactly what she would expect from Jack Curtis, who had clearly learned his lessons well during their time together years ago. "We could wait for nightfall," Diego suggested. "Try to slip through under the cover of darkness." Sarah shook her head. "They'll expect that. Besides, cattle don't move well in darkness. Too easy to lose some to the river." She lowered her glasses. Decision made. "No, we need to change the rules of this engagement entirely." From her saddlebag, Sarah withdrew a folded piece of paper, a rough map she had sketched years earlier during her explorations of the region. "There's something Blackwell and Curtis don't know about Carter's Crossing. Something most local people have forgotten." Diego and Carlos leaned closer as Sarah indicated a point upstream from their current position. The original crossing was here, before the flash flood of '68 changed the river's course. It's more treacherous, deeper water, stronger current, but the old ford still exists beneath the surface. With proper guidance, the cattle can make it across. "And once on the other side?" Robert asked, having joined them from the herd. "We'd bypass the ambush entirely," Sarah explained. "They're positioned to trap us in the narrow passage. If we cross upstream and continue along the eastern bank, we'll be past their positions before they even realize what's happened." Diego studied the proposed route with concern. "The water looks dangerous, and the exit bank is steep." "It is," Sarah acknowledged, "but I've crossed it before. With Thunder leading and all 3 of you managing the flanks, we can make it." A silent exchange of glances passed between the men, measuring the risk against the certainty of facing Blackwell's gunmen in the narrow pass. Finally, Robert nodded. "I trust your judgment, Sarah. Always have." "One more thing," Sarah added, checking her Winchester's action with practiced hands. "Once we start the crossing, Blackwell's lookout will spot us. They'll reposition quickly. To intercept, I'll need to provide discouragement." The implication was clear. While the men managed the hazardous river crossing, Sarah would take up a position to hold off any pursuit, a task that would require the extraordinary marksmanship, skill she had kept hidden for so many years. "That's suicide," Carlos protested. "You can't face Blackwell's entire gang alone." Sarah's expression remained calm, almost serene. "I don't intend to face the entire gang, Carlos. Just slow them down long enough for you to get the herd across and move towards safer ground." Before further objections could be raised, she swung into Midnight's saddle with fluid grace. "Get the cattle moving toward the old ford. I'll join you shortly after making some preparations." Without waiting for a response, she guided Midnight along a barely visible trail that climbed the western ridge. The stallion moved with sure-footed confidence, navigating the steep terrain as if sensing the importance of their mission. When they reached a rocky outcropping with clear sightlines to both the old ford and the established crossing, Sarah dismounted. This position offered both concealment and multiple firing angles, exactly what she needed for what would come next. From her saddlebags, she retrieved items that hadn't seen use since her performance days. A specialized ammunition belt with custom-loaded cartridges, a small brass spyglass modified for range estimation, and a leather wrist guard that had once been part of her show costume, but served the practical purpose of preventing painful recoil during rapid-fire sequences. As she prepared her position, Sarah found herself slipping into the focused mental state that had once been second nature during performances. Her breathing slowed, her senses sharpened, the distractions of fatigue and worry receding as she calculated distances, wind conditions, and potential targets with mathematical precision. Through her spyglass, she watched Diego and Carlos begin, moving the herd toward the old ford, with Robert positioned at the rear to prevent strays. Thunder, the massive lead steer, initially hesitated at the water's edge before Diego's gentle coaxing convinced him to enter the swift current. The rest of the herd followed, creating a living chain of cattle stretching across the dangerous waters. Some animals struggled against the current, but the skilled guidance of the drovers kept the crossing orderly, if slow. It took less than 10 minutes for Blackwell's lookout to spot the unexpected maneuver. The man immediately signaled to his companions with a mirror flash, and soon Sarah observed frantic activity at the ambush positions as men realized their carefully planned trap was being circumvented. "Right on schedule," she murmured, tracking the first riders who emerged from concealment, racing toward the old ford to intercept the crossing herd. Sarah took a deep breath, held it for 2 seconds, then exhaled slowly as she brought the Winchester to her shoulder. The first shot was not aimed at the riders themselves, but at the ground directly in front of the lead horse, kicking up a spray of dirt that caused the animal to rear in panic, throwing its rider. The second and third shots followed in rapid succession, one disarming a man who had raised his rifle toward the crossing cattle, the other splintering the stock of another weapon being drawn from its scabbard. Non-lethal shots, but delivered with such speed and precision that they created immediate confusion among Blackwell's men, who couldn't identify the source of the accurate fire. From her elevated position, Sarah continued to place carefully aimed shots that disrupted without killing, disabling weapons, unseating riders, creating barriers of kicked-up earth and splintered rock that stalled the pursuit. Each pull of the trigger was a calculated decision, each bullet finding its mark with unerring accuracy. The crossing continued below, the cattle now more than halfway across the treacherous ford. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before turning her attention to new movement along the eastern ridge, a lone rider approaching from the south, separate from the main group of Blackwell's men. Even at this distance, she recognized Jack Curtis's distinctive silhouette. Unlike his confused companions, Jack had immediately understood what was happening and was moving to a position where he could counter Sarah's covering fire. Still reading the battlefield correctly, Sarah murmured with grudging respect as she tracked his progress. Jack had clearly deduced her likely position based on the trajectory of her shots, applying the very lessons she had taught him years ago. Their confrontation was inevitable now. Student versus teacher, each knowing the other's methods and mindset. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, seeking better cover as she prepared for the most challenging exchange of the morning. Through her spyglass, she watched Jack dismount and advance on foot, using the terrain for concealment in a way that would make him nearly invisible to anyone without Sarah's trained eye. His approach was methodical, patient, the movement of a hunter rather than a gunman. Sarah held her fire, conserving ammunition and waiting for the right moment. Below, the last of the cattle were reaching the eastern bank, Diego and Carlos working frantically to establish control of the herd, while Robert provided rear guard. Jack's first shot came without warning, a precise round that struck inches from Sarah's position, showering her with stone fragments, a warning, not an attempt to kill. Sarah responded in kind, her bullet kicking up dirt near his concealed location. For several minutes they exchanged carefully placed shots, neither attempting to hit the other directly, but each demonstrating their extraordinary skill. It was a strange, dangerous conversation conducted in gunfire, each shot conveying messages that words couldn't express. Then came the moment Sarah had been waiting for. Jack, attempting to advance to a better position, momentarily exposed himself. Sarah's shot struck his rifle directly, splintering the wooden stock and rendering the weapon useless without harming Jack himself. A stunned silence followed. Sarah rose from her concealment, Winchester still ready but not aimed directly at her former student. "You could have taken that shot center mass," Jack called across the distance separating them. "Why didn't you?" "The same reason you aimed for the rock beside me, rather than my head," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed." Jack stood slowly, his disabled rifle hanging uselessly at his side. "Blackwell won't stop, you know that. I'm counting on it," Sarah confirmed. "By the time your employer regroups and replans, my cattle will be within sight of Cheyenne and beyond his reach." "And me?" Jack asked, his hand hovering near his holstered revolver. Sarah's Winchester remained steady. "That depends on you, Jack. The young scout I knew in St. Louis wouldn't be working for a man like Blackwell, helping destroy honest ranchers for profit." "That young scout grew up," Jack replied, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "Discovering the world doesn't reward honesty and principle. It rewards power and connection." "Is that what you've found with Blackwell?" "Reward?" Sarah challenged. "Or just another master to serve while compromising whatever remains of your integrity?" The question hung between them, unanswered. Below, the last of the split pine cattle had successfully crossed the river and were being directed northward, along the eastern bank, away from the established ambush positions. Sarah's diversionary tactic had worked perfectly. "It's not too late to make different choices," Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. "Rebecca still believes in you, even if you've stopped believing in yourself." Jack's expression tightened at the mention of his sister. Easy moral judgments from the woman who abandoned her talent to become a rancher's wife. "Was domestic obscurity everything you hoped for, Sarah?" The barb struck deeper than Sarah would have admitted, but her voice remained steady. "I chose a life with meaning and purpose, Jack. Thomas Hargrove was a good man who saw me as more than a performer or a curiosity. What meaning have you found in Blackwell's employ? What is the purpose beyond violence and intimidation?" For a moment, something vulnerable flickered in Jack's weathered features, a glimpse of the idealistic young scout beneath the hardened exterior. Then his professional mask reasserted itself. "Blackwell has 20 more men within a day's ride," he stated flatly. "This isn't over." "No," Sarah agreed, "but the next phase won't be played out here. Tell your employer that split pine cattle will reach the Cheyenne stockyards tomorrow, along with documented evidence of his operation that I've arranged to deliver to Judge Morrison personally." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What evidence?" "Thomas. Kept records, Jack. Detailed records of every offer, every threat, every suspicious incident. After his death, I found them, along with instructions to deliver them to the territorial judge if anything happened to him." Sarah's expression hardened. He knew Blackwell was dangerous. What he couldn't have known was how far your employer would go to eliminate opposition. The implication hung in the air between them. Jack's gaze fell, a combination of confusion and dawning comprehension crossing his features. "You think Blackwell was behind Thomas's death?" he said. Not quite a question. "I know he was," Sarah replied with quiet certainty. "The bullet I removed from my husband's body matched ammunition used exclusively by Blackwell's personal huntsman, a fact that will be presented to Judge Morrison, along with Thomas's documentation." Jack absorbed this information, his expression unreadable. Whatever his moral compromises, discovering his employer's involvement in cold-blooded murder clearly disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Now you make a choice," Sarah told him, lowering her Winchester slightly. "Return to Blackwell with news of another failure, knowing what you now know about him. Or ride away, start fresh somewhere far from here. That simple?" "Nothing about this is simple, Jack, but some choices are clearer than others." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the cattle drive continuing its progress toward Cheyenne. Finally, Jack removed his gun belt, dropping it deliberately onto the rocky ground. "Tell Rebecca," he began, then shook his head. "No, I'll tell her myself when this is finished." Without another word, he turned and began walking. Not back, toward Blackwell's position, but eastward, perpendicular to both paths. Sarah watched him go, understanding the significance of his direction. Neither returning to Blackwell nor joining her drive, but choosing a third path, his own. Whether that path would ultimately lead to redemption or further compromise remained to be seen, but the choice itself represented a small victory. When Jack had disappeared from sight, Sarah returned to where Midnight waited patiently. The stallion nickered softly as she approached, his powerful frame ready to carry her onward despite the challenges they'd already faced. "Good boy," she murmured, stroking his sleek neck. One last push to catch up with the others. As she guided Midnight down toward the river crossing, Sarah felt a weight lifting, not just the immediate danger of Blackwell's ambush, but something deeper. For 12 years, she had buried steady-eyed Sarah beneath the identity of Mrs. Thomas Hargrove, believing one life had to end for another to begin. Now she understood that both women had always existed within her. The precise skill and tactical thinking that had made her a celebrated performer had served equally well in defending her ranch and her legacy. Thomas might have been uncomfortable with her public persona, but the abilities that defined her had never truly disappeared. They had simply found new purpose. Sarah rejoined her drive 2 miles north of the crossing, finding the cattle moving steadily under the capable guidance of her small crew. Diego raised his hat in salute as she approached, his expression reflecting both relief at her safe return and respect for what she had accomplished. "Blackwell's men?" he asked as she fell beside him. "Temporarily discouraged," Sarah replied with a hint of a smile, "though I expect they'll regroup once Jack Curtis delivers his report. And will he deliver that report?" Sarah's gaze turned briefly toward the eastern horizon, where Jack had disappeared. "I suspect Blackwell will soon find himself short one tracker." Robert Jackson approached from the rear of the herd, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "These cattle are moving better than I've ever seen a drive through this territory. We'll make Cheyenne by tomorrow afternoon at this pace." "Provided we face no further interference," Sarah cautioned, though her tone remained optimistic. "Blackwell would be a fool to try anything closer to Cheyenne," Robert observed. "Too many witnesses, too many questions." "James Blackwell is many things, but never a fool," Sarah replied. "He'll recognize when a battle is lost and preserve his resources for other confrontations." The drive continued northward through the day, making excellent time across terrain that grew increasingly hospitable. By late afternoon, they encountered the first signs of civilization, fenced grazing lands and occasional homesteads marking their approach to the territorial capital. At a small trading post 20 miles south of Cheyenne, they received unexpected news. The proprietor, an elderly man named Franklin, who had known Thomas Hargrove for decades, rushed out to greet them with a newspaper in hand. "Mrs. Hargrove, have you heard of it? It's all over the territory." Sarah accepted the newspaper, her eyes widening as she read the headline, "Federal Marshals Arrest Cattle Baron Blackwell on Conspiracy Charges." The article detailed a pre-dawn raid on Blackwell's headquarters, led by U.S. Marshal Daniel Wright, acting on evidence provided by multiple sources, including documents delivered by Rebecca Curtis that implicated Blackwell in the murder of Thomas Hargrove. "Rebecca," Sarah murmured, a smile touching her lips as she realized what had happened. While she had been outmaneuvering Blackwell's men at Carter's Crossing, Rebecca had been delivering the evidence directly to federal authorities, the final piece of a strategy that neither woman had fully disclosed to the other. "The article mentions you by name," Franklin pointed out excitedly, "says your testimony will be central to the case against Blackwell's entire operation." Sarah scanned the rest of the article, noting with satisfaction that Sheriff Parker had also been arrested as an accomplice, along with several other local officials implicated in Blackwell's scheme to monopolize the region's water rights and cattle trade. "Seems your cattle drive is more of a victory parade now," Robert observed, reading over her shoulder. Sarah folded the newspaper carefully, her expression thoughtful. "The battle isn't over. Men like Blackwell have resources and connections that extend beyond territorial borders. This is a significant step, but not the end, perhaps," Robert acknowledged. "But it's certainly a day worth celebrating." They continued toward Cheyenne with renewed energy, the cattle drive taking on an almost festive atmosphere as news of Blackwell's arrest spread among the hands. By sunset, they had reached the final campsite before the territorial capital, establishing their night camp with the efficiency of experienced drivers. As the men settled around the campfire, Sarah walked to a small rise overlooking their position. The lights of Cheyenne glimmered in the distance, promising safety and the successful conclusion of their journey. Behind them stretched the vast Wyoming wilderness they had navigated against overwhelming odds. Sarah removed her worn hat, allowing the evening breeze to cool her face as she reflected on the extraordinary days just past. She had entered this drive as Sarah Hargrove, widow and rancher, determined to preserve her husband's legacy. She would complete it as a woman fully reconciled to all aspects of herself: the performer, the sharpshooter, the strategist, and the rancher, each identity strengthening rather than diminishing the others. Diego approached quietly, offering a cup of coffee. "Beautiful view," he observed, nodding toward the distant city lights. "Worth fighting for," Sarah agreed, accepting the cup gratefully. "What happens after we sell the cattle?" Diego asked the question that had been on everyone's mind, but none had voiced directly. "Rebecca," Sarah murmured, a smile touching her lips as she realized what had happened. While she had been outmaneuvering Blackwell's men at Carter's Crossing, Rebecca had been delivering the evidence directly to federal authorities, the final piece of a strategy that neither woman had fully disclosed to the other. "The article mentions you by name," Franklin pointed out excitedly, "says your testimony will be central to the case against Blackwell's entire operation." Sarah scanned the rest of the article, noting with satisfaction that Sheriff Parker had also been arrested as an accomplice, along with several other local officials implicated in Blackwell's scheme to monopolize the region's water rights and cattle trade. "Seems your cattle drive is more of a victory parade now," Robert observed, reading over her shoulder. Sarah folded the newspaper carefully, her expression thoughtful. "The battle isn't over. Men like Blackwell have resources and connections that extend beyond territorial borders. This is a significant step, but not the end, perhaps," Robert acknowledged. "But it's certainly a day worth celebrating." They continued toward Cheyenne with renewed energy, the cattle drive taking on an almost festive atmosphere as news of Blackwell's arrest spread among the hands. By sunset, they had reached the final campsite before the territorial capital, establishing their night camp with the efficiency of experienced drivers. As the men settled around the campfire, Sarah walked to a small rise overlooking their position. The lights of Cheyenne glimmered in the distance, promising safety and the successful conclusion of their journey. Behind them stretched the vast Wyoming wilderness they had navigated against overwhelming odds. Sarah removed her worn hat, allowing the evening breeze to cool her face as she reflected on the extraordinary days just past. She had entered this drive as Sarah Hargrove, widow and rancher, determined to preserve her husband's legacy. She would complete it as a woman fully reconciled to all aspects of herself: the performer, the sharpshooter, the strategist, and the rancher, each identity strengthening rather than diminishing the others. Diego approached quietly, offering a cup of coffee. "Beautiful view," he observed, nodding toward the distant city lights. "Worth fighting for," Sarah agreed, accepting the cup gratefully. "What happens after we sell the cattle?" Diego asked the question that had been on everyone's mind, but none had voiced directly. Sarah sipped her coffee before answering. "Split Pine continues. We rebuild, expand, adapt to whatever comes next. Thomas would have wanted that." "And steady eye, Sarah," Diego ventured carefully. "Will she return to retirement?" The question might have offended her once, seeming to reduce her complex identity to a stage name. Now Sarah found herself considering it thoughtfully. "Steady Eye Sarah was never just a performer," she replied. "She was a woman who refused to accept the limitations others placed on her abilities. That refusal continues, though perhaps in different forms." Diego nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. The territory will be changing now, with Blackwell gone. "Change was coming regardless," Sarah observed. "Men like Blackwell recognize inevitable transitions and attempt to control them for personal gain. Our task is to ensure that change benefits the many, not just the powerful few." As darkness settled fully over the Wyoming plains, Sarah returned to camp with Diego, joining the men gathered around the fire. Their faces, illuminated by flickering flames, reflected the diverse backgrounds that had come together in common purpose during this cattle drive. Hispanic vaqueros, American frontiersmen, young hands seeking to prove themselves alongside veterans. Of countless drives, Thomas had built Split Pine Ranch on principles of fairness and mutual respect that were all too rare in the evolving territories. Sarah had maintained those principles through the hardest days following his death. Now, with Blackwell's threat neutralized and the ranch's future secure, she could build upon that foundation, creating something that honored Thomas's vision while incorporating her own unique strengths. The Winchester rifle rested beside her, its presence a reminder of the skills she had reclaimed and the identity she had reintegrated. No longer hidden away like a shameful secret, her extraordinary abilities had become recognized tools for protecting what mattered: her ranch, her people, her future. As the stars emerged above the Wyoming wilderness, Sarah Hargrove lifted her coffee cup in a silent toast to Thomas, to the journey completed, and to the woman she had finally fully become. Not just a widow with a rifle, but a legend in her own right, whose story was only beginning to unfold across the changing American frontier. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.